We'll pick back up where we left off. We were talking about the problems that urban inhabitants and residents, the peasants flocking in from the countryside into the cities are facing. Among them, all the inadequacies and all the degradations that workers faced and that the working poor faced, the one that topped the list was probably housing. There simply aren't enough adequate places to live. Urban housing shortages are going to be endemic throughout the empire during this period. Large, hastily built tenements are going to be constructed, basically workers' barracks, as owners look to maximize profits by crowding as many bodies as possible into subdivided and sub-subdivided spaces. In Moscow, at the turn of the 20th century, the population density per living unit was about double that of London. So you got twice as many people living in the same amount of space in Moscow than you do in London. Think about that when you think about how big Russia is as a country and how much space there is. It's one of the real paradoxes. Largest land country in the world, there's not enough space for people in the second city of Moscow. St. Petersburg is actually worse. Living conditions in St. Petersburg are worse. In 1904, the average apartment house in St. Petersburg housed roughly 6.5 people per room. Concentrations, of course, would be higher in working class districts. Less fortunate workers had nothing more to call home than a wooden bunk in a tightly packed factory barracks. Those barracks typically lacked amenities like kitchens and washrooms. Needless to say, they would be infested with lice, fleas, and other vermin. Maxim Gorky, our writer, would call them, I think accurately, dwellings for a prehistoric people. Despite all the modernity and the new technologies that were arriving in Russia, those who were working in the lower depths were living lives that were degraded, that were impoverished, and that frankly were disease-infested. Inadequate housing was coupled with inadequate sanitation and inadequate water supply. These were additional sources of misery. The worst conditions were found in St. Petersburg. Excrement piled high in backyards until wooden carts came to collect it at night. Water would be fetched from street pumps and wells. It had to be boiled before it was safe to drink. Throughout the city, on house fronts, inside tram cars, in hundreds of public areas, there were placards in bold red letters warning people not to drink the water. Thirsty workers, especially those who had recently arrived from the villages, paid little attention to the signs. Disease and death naturally followed. Mortality rates in Russia's largest cities were the highest in Europe. On average, a cholera outbreak struck St. Petersburg every 3 years. The most deadly occurred in 1908-1909. It claimed 30,000 lives. Moscow was Europe's unhealthiest big city. Moscow would endure 4 cholera epidemics, along with 8 outbreaks of smallpox and 10 outbreaks of typhus between 1883 and 1917. In 1910, the city's infant mortality rate exceeded Western European levels by 50 to 70%. Moscow's overall death rate of 26.9 per 10,000 inhabitants surpassed Paris, Vienna, and Berlin by more than 250%. The situation for the urban poor in Russia's cities was simply deplorable. What came with the industrial takeoff? Arrival of folks from the countryside, overcrowding, slum conditions, disease, death, and with it, growing social discontent. The first large-scale strikes would hit Russia in 1870 and 1872. The first at St. Petersburg's Nevsky spinning plant, the second at a cotton spinning and weaving factory in Estonia. These would be the first examples of large-scale urban unrest in Russian history. And it spooked government leaders and civic officials. And Tsarist ministers will meet and commissions will be formed to address the workers' question, but they tend to be ineffective. They don't really produce any lasting results. They're hampered in part by the state's efforts to treat strike leaders as criminal conspirators. And I talked about this in the last lecture as well as regards the students. When student unrest breaks out over the economic plight of, say, university students or polytechnic students, which are very deplorable as well. You've got rising student populations. They're not living well. They're eating maybe one meal a day. They're in dilapidated dormitories or in overcrowded classrooms. Students get upset. They strike for economic reasons. The state steps in, arrests the leaders, exiles them, sends them to Siberia, kicks them out of university altogether, like the Levo Dobrovolsky. And in the process of doing so, they take those students' economic grievances and they take the students, and the students end up becoming politically radicalized because of the way they've been treated by the state. Ham-fisted, heavy-handed efforts by the autocracy to quash the uprising only serves to feed and expand the ranks of the disaffected. That was the case for university students. It's going to be the exact same for the workers. It's also going to be true for Russia's thinking elite. Now, the onset of the very first significant protests by Russian workers occurs at almost the same time as another momentous event, but an event that's a little bit less dramatic. It's momentous, but it's not as splashy. And that was the introduction of Marxism to Russia's thinking class. Marxism, born of the imagination of the phenomenally prolific and the chronically unemployed German philosopher Karl Marx. Marxism begins in the mid-1840s as an analysis of advanced industrial society in Western Europe. And it evolves in concert with positivism. I remember me talking several weeks back about Auguste Comte, positivism, the faith in science. This is the age of not only of Marx and Comte, it's also the age of Charles Darwin. His writings in the 1870s and the 1880s are becoming popularized. Science and scientific method appears to be the way of identifying answers to long-standing questions and of solving society's ills. Marxism very quickly develops into a speculative ideological system that purports to explain, through empirical observation, the material origins, nature, and endpoint of human history. Scientific socialism is what Marx's helpmate and his chief financier, Friedrich Engels, calls it. Marxism is scientific socialism. You are going to take empirical methods and observation, wed it to the socialist cause, and you are going to produce a science that will unlock the keys of human history. Marxism claimed to do this by identifying the fundamental economic relationships that Marx believed determined all of society's cultural and political institutions. These relationships are not static. They evolved over time through a dynamic engine known as the class struggle. In other words, the ongoing war between the haves and the have-nots. Over time, this continuing struggle is going to produce greater and greater concentrations of wealth until history had been moved forward into the contemporary industrial bourgeois order. The large-scale factories that defined the economic systems of Europe's leading states had made possible technical and scientific advances, productive advances that far surpassed anything in human history. What Marx theorized was that in doing so, in creating these huge factory environments for the downtrodden proletariat, what Marx theorized is that industrialized society was sowing the seeds of its own destruction. The industrial society was built upon the exploitation of workers. What Marxism purported to identify is the workers, the working class in industrial factories, known in Marxist parlance as the proletariat. Proletariat was the vanguard revolutionary force in human history. It was the leading edge of revolution, the final revolution that was to come, that would overthrow the industrial order, seize the means of production, the factories and enterprises, from the capitalist bourgeois owners, and then take control of them in the name of the working class, who would come together across national, ethnic, religious, and other boundaries to form an international proletariat, creating a dictatorship initially that would use the fruits of production not to enrich the few, but to supply the needs of the many. And that once everybody's basic needs were supplied, there would be no need for theft, There would be no need for violence or war because we would all enjoy the fruits of our own labor. At that point, the state and its oppressive apparatus, the police and the army, the dogma of religion would melt away, and what would emerge was the endpoint of human history, communism. That would look, I suspect, not that much unlike Chernyshevsky's Crystal Palace dream, Vera Pavlovna's fourth dream. Right? Everybody laboring happily in the fields and coming together in fellowship in the evening under a technologically advanced brotherhood of all. This is the idea. Marxism arrives in Russia, and when it does, it marks a turning point both for Russia and for Marxism. Russia still has a censorship regime, and Marx's manuscript, his main manuscript, Capital, Das Kapital, it reaches the censor's desk, and the censors pour through this thing, and they conclude, and I'm quoting, that the book was nothing more than a colossal mass of abstruse, somewhat obscure arguments that are both difficult and inaccessible to readers. And given this, the censors figured, what the hell, you can publish it, no one's going to read it. This is the very first time that Marx's magnum opus is translated into a foreign language. It's translated into Russian first. It's approved for publication in 1872. Within 6 weeks, 900 of the initial 3,000 print run were sold out. By which point the state censors realized, well, they realized about 10 months later, we made a mistake. And they immediately moved to ban it. But before they can, all the rest of the books are snatched up. They recognize only belatedly that it's a subversive tome. Whom does Marxism affect? Everybody. Populists, Slavophiles, Westernizers embrace the argument that Marx makes about the miseries associated with factory life. It becomes really the standard go-to critique of the excesses and the degradation imposed upon factory workers in Russia. By the late 1870s, the early 1880s, Marxist ideas had infected the minds of most members of the radical intelligentsia. This is not the last time, not the first time a mistake by state censors has opened up an intellectual sea change. We saw it with Radishev, we saw it with Chadaev. It's going to happen again with Marx. So Marxism emerges as an idea. It emerges as a political movement about a decade later, thanks to the efforts of this fellow, Georgy Plekhanov, a former populist living in exile in Geneva. Plekhanov sees in Marx a solution to the dilemma of how to transform agrarian Russia into a post-capitalist society without having to resort to the terrorism that had failed to topple the autocracy following the assassination of Alexander II. He will put together the very first Russian social democratic organization. When you hear in European and Russian history classes the phrase social democrat, this is a synonym for Marxist. Plekhanov is going to organize the very first Russian social democratic organization. It's called Emancipation of Labor. And he begins producing pamphlets and ideas that are going to be printed in Geneva. And then the revolutionary ideas are going to filter into Russia illegally across the border. Remember Herzen and the Free Russian Press? What Plekhanov is doing is he's following on that example established by Herzen in the 1850s and the 1860s. Now, not a lot's going to happen initially. Marxism arrives and begins to be popularized by Plekhanov, but Marxism is going to be held in check, and most radical doctrines are going to be held in check in the 1880s. It's only after the famine of 1891-1892 that the revolutionary ranks are going to revive. The famine sort of calls into question all the social problems that Russians were aware of. And the other thing that's going to emerge in the early 1890s and the mid-1890s, by now you've had the rapid growth of the polytechnics and the universities. Those students are going to emerge, many of them members of the Razluchinцы. those individuals without place, without rank. Now the universities are going to become hotbeds of student radicalism, and a lot of the things they're discussing are these Marxist ideas. Not just social democracy, but Marx is going to be, like I said, the emerging dominant idea, along with an agrarian socialism known as the Socialist Revolutionary Party. There are going to be a number of individuals who are going to embrace these radical ideas. Nowhere do these radical ideas emerge and thrive better than in the emerging network of schools and polytechnics. What the state has done is in attempting to expand educational opportunity in order to provide the necessary managers and engineers and technicians for Russian industry to expand, what the state has done is it's concentrated a very large population of young men and women on university campuses, at polytechnic institutes. And these are going to serve as the chief incubators for spreading revolutionary Marxism. It's going to come from the students. The center of student activism is the St. Petersburg Practical Technological Institute, which was, by the turn of the 20th century, Russia's largest technical school. It brought upwards of 800 students together in a single location, where they endured a regime of laboratories and workshops under conditions that memoirists would later say were absolutely deplorable, just like working in a factory. In 1890, a small group of students are going to be organizing a study circle similar to the Kruzhok that we talked about for the 1830s, where Herzen, and before Herzen even, Chadaev and Belinsky, Stankiewicz and others had organized those Kruzhki, or the Kruzhok, at the university circles. The students are doing the same thing in the 1880s and 1890s. Only now, rather than addressing Romanticism, the latest ideas of Fichte or Herder or Schelling from Germany, they're talking about radical Marxist ideas, percolating their way into Russia thanks to Plekhanov and thanks to the spread now of these illicit texts. Radical students, if they were caught, could be expelled from university, and so too could members of the rising ranks of the professional class. But the punishments that were meted out to students at technological and polytechnic institutes, and the punishments that were meted out to professional engineers, tended to be less harsh because they were mitigated by the state's desperate need for native experts to support technological modernization. This is one of the problems the state has. I talked about this at length in the last lecture. The state desperately needs technologically savvy individuals to work in the factories, to oversee production processes, to electrify cities, to build rail cars and rail networks. So they're going to train a new generation of workers in these rapidly constructed polytechnic institutes. But it's not just engineering, it's not just electricity, it's not just physics these students are studying. They're also getting together in their after hours and they're complaining about the life that they face. They're complaining about the hardships, the fact their state stipend hasn't come through, that they're living hand to mouth, that their dormitory room is cold and overcrowded, that the lectures are boring, that life should be better. And if it wasn't for the oppressive state, comrades, it would be. And what these students are doing is they're becoming highly politicized. And they're becoming alienated from the state and society that they're supposed to be contributing to once they're educated members of Russian obsessionists. This is the dangerous game that the state is playing. It wants educated members of Russian society with technical skills, but it doesn't want free thinkers any more than Peter the Great wanted free thinkers when he established the mathematical schools at the turn of the 18th century. Remember, you're going to teach those who want to learn, and you're going to compel those who don't. This is what Peter the Great's doing in 1720. What is it they're doing in the 1890s? Well, they're not exactly compelling people to learn. There's a great demand for education, because for members of the provincial gentry, the impoverished gentry, if you're the son of a gentry owner who doesn't have a lot of land, you recognize that technical education gives you the opportunity for having a profession. You can become a factory engineer, and you can use that as a way of making your way in the world. But as you're receiving your education, your eyes are opening up to an entire world that you didn't understand, you hadn't seen before. And so the process, in addition to being a means of social upward mobility, these technical schools and universities can also be seedbeds here of radicalizing young men and women's ideas. Maybe a couple of examples here. There are two members of the St. Petersburg Practical Technological Institute, a fellow by the name of Leonid Krasin, Krasin, along with him, a fellow by the name of Mikhail Brusnev. You don't have to remember their names. Just I want to tell you their story because it gives you an idea here of the dilemma that the state faces. Both Krasin and Brusnev had gone to the St. Petersburg Technological Institute, and they trained as engineers. Both of them are going to endure several years of prison and internal exile for taking part in the student movement. Despite the fact that as students they were in prison and exile, they're nevertheless able to complete their degrees, and they're going to be able to establish professional careers. Why? Because the state needs what they know. Krasin, during the time that he has been exiled to Siberia, he's banished to the region around Lake Baikal, and while he's in exile, he's going to work as an engineer on the Trans-Siberian Railway. You've got to have the thing built. Where do these engineers come from? Well, this one's been pulled out of exile because he's got technical training. He's sent to work. He's going to return from exile in 1900, and he goes to Baku, main petroleum-producing region in Russia along the Caspian Sea. And there he meets up with his ex-classmate, a fellow Klassen, who at the time is in Baku on internal exile. He's been sent to Baku by the state. The two of them are going to come together and they're going to work in Baku helping to construct and build an electric generating station for the city of Baku, one that also modernizes the city's oil fields. Krasin is going to be transferred 5 years later to St. Petersburg. He takes up a position with something known as the 1886 Company. It's a German electrical firm, a subsidiary that's bringing electric lighting to the imperial capital. What Krasin is doing the entire time that he is working as an engineer on these state projects is he's leading a double life. In addition to being an engineer working for the state, he's also engaged in conspiratorial activities, helping something known as the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party Bolshevik faction. Krasin is supporting, through his job, the money that he makes, and in his position as an engineer, the money that he can skim from state coffers. He's embezzling state funds, using his position as an engineer, turning around and using those funds to help the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, publish their revolutionary newspapers and pamphlets. And the state can't step in and quash him because they need his expertise. But he's going to leverage his expertise to advance the revolutionary movement. To be honest, most technical experts, most engineers, are not conspiratorial Marxists. But the state's refusal to consider even moderate political reforms would drive growing ranks of the technical intelligentsia and technological intelligentsia to embrace radical doctrines. There's no better example than this fellow, a fellow by the name of Peter Palczynski. He too is a graduate of a technical institute, the St. Petersburg Mining Institute. He would begin his professional career in 1901 as a member of a commission that's dispatched to investigate declining coal production in the Don Basin. Senior colleagues are given the responsibility of investigating the operational aspect of the mining enterprise. Palczynski is given the less prestigious task of undertaking research into what was called euphemistically the workers' question. In other words, you're going to look at how workers live and how they undertake their shifts and what their conditions are like, and is there anything in the way that they live that affect their labor? What Palczynski discovers in conducting his research are overcrowded barracks, inadequate sanitation, dangerous work conditions. These are all normal in Russian coal production. He spends 2 years compiling an absolute mountain of photographs, drawings, interviews, and statistics, all of which lead inexorably to the clear conclusion that the terrible mistreatment of laborers directly correlates with industrial inefficiency. If the workers aren't eating enough, if they don't have access to clean water, if they're living in overcrowded barracks, if they're not getting enough sleep, if they're falling prey to cholera and dysentery, along with just regular mundane things, they are not going to work well. It should be obvious. Palczynski provides his directors with empirical proof that the living conditions of workers have to be improved upon. The report is going to make its way all the way to the very top of the ministries of finance and trade. And the very highest level bureaucrats in the Tsarist order recognize the value of what Palczynski has done. They also recognize that the political implications are exceedingly dangerous. Palczynski later is going to take it upon himself to publish excerpts of his findings in a professional journal. And for doing so, he is going to be dismissed from the commission and sent into administrative exile. He's sent into exile, but characteristically, he's going to continue working. He's going to work as a mining consultant. The experience is going to alienate him completely from the Tsarist order, and this is going to serve to radicalize his views. He never joins the Bolsheviks. He never formally joins the oppositional movement, but he does become an increasingly strident critic of the government. What's interesting from our standpoints about Palczynski, he sort of underscores once again the real constraints, the real dilemmas that are posed by Russia's archaic state system. Technocratic officials like Sergei Witte had promoted modernization through the appropriation and the assimilation of foreign tools and techniques. But they resisted any ideas that suggested you needed to alter the political or social structure of the autocratic order. There's rapidly changing material circumstance in Russia, but throughout this period of tumultuous growth and rapid expanse of industry and urban society, the ideological linchpins of Tsarism, bureaucratic authority, autocratic prerogative, cannot be touched. Those are the two things you can't touch. From time to time, you might get ideas for reform among the top ministers. Witte is an example. That's okay. But are ideas allowed to percolate up from the bottom to the top? No. Because those ideas are almost certainly going to be democratic. And democratic is understood to be a very nasty word in the absolutist system. The autocracy, in short, folks, is reactionary. And because it is reactionary, when change comes, it comes too little and too late to keep pace with the growing calls for liberal political reform that are being voiced by the emerging members of our civil society. In 1903, the Socialist Revolutionary Party is going to openly embrace terrorism as a tactic for bringing the autocracy to its knees. This is more symptomatic of the continuing problems in Russia than it is anything else. The Socialist Revolutionary Party is going to embark upon a widespread campaign of terrorism. They're going to begin undertaking targeted assassinations. The very highest levels of government, all the way out to provincial governors, police officers. And in the 2 decades prior to the fall of the autocracy in 1917, there are an estimated 17,000 people killed or wounded as a result of terrorist attacks in Russia across the entire empire. Now, put that in perspective. You've got 17,000, just under 1,000 people being killed or wounded every year in terrorist attacks over a span of 20 years. The autocracy is struggling to come to terms with all of this. Now, this all might have been ameliorated if you had a forceful and far-sighted leader at the head of the state. But, unfortunately, Russia's last Tsar was not. Nicholas II was weak and vacillating. He was constitutionally ill-suited to serve as the head of state, especially as head of state over a rapidly modernizing multi-ethnic empire. He had a narrow, anachronistic worldview. It was defined by unwavering commitments to autocratic prerogative and a mystical faith in the paternalistic bond that existed between the Tsar and his people. Nicholas was oblivious to the daily travails of ordinary subjects, and he was highly suspicious of his own bureaucracy. He was intellectually detached, and he was indecisive at key moments. And this would only contribute to the political paralysis that gradually descended upon the empire. And it's with the coming to power of Nicholas II in 1894 that the Russian autocracy is going to enter its final set of crises. The last act in Russia's imperial drama begins with war. A war that is launched on the night of 8 to 9 February 1904, when a squadron of Japanese naval vessels launched a surprise attack on Russian ships anchored in Port Arthur, in the Russian Far East. Remember, this is a contemporary map showing Manchuria at the time is divided. The Chinese, the Japanese, and the Russians are vying for control over Manchuria. 1904, what's recently been opened, Trans-Siberian Railway, built all the way across this vast expanse, dating back to the early 1890s, under the leadership of Sergei Witte. The purpose for which was to join the Far East to European Russia, to make Russia transitable, and also to give the Russians an ability to project force into the Far East. What did the Trans-Siberian Railroad do? Well, it antagonized the hell out of the Japanese. A militaristic government which has emerged and begun the process of modernization with the aid and support of the British and the French. We're going to underwrite Meiji Japan's entrance into the modern world by providing them with technical assistance and military help, money, and even blueprints for naval vessels and things along those lines. The French and the British in the 1890s are training the Japanese after in the methods of European ways of war and European ways of industry. And who is going to be targeted first by the Japanese? It'll be the Russians. They target the Russians because they're upset at Russia's growing influence in the Far East. They see Russia's interference in Manchuria. They see the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway as a direct threat to their interests in the region. Late in the evening of the 8th of February, early into the morning of the 9th of February, Japanese naval vessels launch a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet, which is anchored at Port Arthur. This attack is going to set into motion a year-and-a-half-long conflict. Once the fighting commenced, the Trans-Siberian Railway, which helped to bring about the conflict, proves to be inadequate for moving men and materiel across that vast expanse. It's a single-track railway. The Russians haven't been able to build double tracks. It's too expensive. It's only going to come much, much, much later. One of the ironies of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 is that neither side lacked for advanced weapons of war. Both sides possessed them. Both sides possessed them. As I've already said, the Japanese had been building up their naval and military forces with the support of the British. The Russians had been doing this for about the last 10 years with the support of the French. Both the Russians and the Japanese employ the very latest military innovations during the course of this conflict. On land, rapid-firing artillery, machine guns, bolt-action rifles, and hand grenades, barbed wire, and electric fencing are going to contribute to the conflict's high casualty rates. At sea, we witness the extensive use of mines, underwater torpedoes, also the appearance of the first heavily armored ironclad battleships. We actually have the first modern naval wars are going to be, naval encounters are going to be fought in the Russo-Japanese War. In the air, tactical radio signaling, radio jamming, and tethered observation balloons are going to expand communications capabilities. Unfortunately for Russian conscripts, the leaders who send them into battle are not as advanced as the technologies at the conscripts' disposal. The Russian High Command, its officers in the field, proved to be indecisive and at times utterly incompetent. The conflict is an unmitigated disaster for Russia. The Battle of Port Arthur technically ends in a draw, but it bottles up the Russian fleet, and the Russian admiral never wants to leave the harbor after that initial engagement. This gives the Japanese the ability to seize the initiative, and the Japanese are going to dominate the seas for the duration of the fighting. There is a daring effort made by the Russian Navy to relocate its Baltic fleet stationed in St. Petersburg to the Far East. And what the Russians are going to do, what the Russian Navy is going to do, the Russian Navy will set sail from St. Petersburg, and it sets sails from St. Petersburg on a 9-month, 18,000-mile journey. Sailing out of the Baltic into the North Sea, and when they get to the North Sea, they encounter Japanese naval vessels. And there's an exchange of fire. Only at which point the Russians realized those were not Japanese naval vessels. They were British fishing boats. So the Russians are a little bit antsy. Well, after what this is, it's the famous Dogger Bank episode. The Russians are going to fire on the British. It's a diplomatic incident. Raises questions about the Russians' competence. All the same, the Baltic fleet is going to make its way over 9 months to arrive here just in time for what is known as the Battle of Tsushima Straits. It's the last major naval engagement of the war, and it ends in the destruction of virtually the entire Russian fleet. The sailors arrive a little bit tired, obviously, from their journey, and what the Russian admiral in charge of the fleet decides that he wants to do is he's going to shoot the strait separating Japan from the mainland. He's going to shoot the strait to try and get into Port Arthur. The Japanese are lying in wait for him. In the meantime, the Russians are experiencing a series of defeats on land. Port Arthur itself will fall after a protracted siege on the 2nd of January 1905. And by that time, it's clear things are spinning out of control. Fighting will finally draw to a close in the spring of 1905, by which time the Russians have lost upwards of 200,000 men. The treaty will be signed, it will be negotiated and signed in Portsmouth in the United States. The individual who presides over the signing of the treaty is President Teddy Roosevelt. And for his efforts, he is going to get a Nobel Peace Prize. So there's that. The government's calamitous effort in the Russo-Japanese War has a devastating effect on the Russian government. As tidings arrive from the East, public criticism of the autocracy continues to mount. Urban workers begin launching strikes in protest of economic dislocations occasioned by the war effort. Liberal thinkers, members of the professional groups begin rallying behind the idea of creating a national zemstva that can represent the interest of the nation as a whole. The Socialist Revolutionary Combat Organization, the terrorist wing of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, is going to ratchet up its campaign of terror. In July of 1904, the Socialist Revolutionary terrorists are going to assassinate the Interior Minister, a fellow by the name of Vyacheslav von Pleva. This would be the equivalent. This would be effectively the equivalent of terrorists assassinating the head of the FBI. And what is really astounding isn't the fact that they just kill him, it's the public reaction. The public reaction to the minister's assassination ranges from complete indifference to celebration. There's open celebration in St. Petersburg over the fact that this guy was assassinated. And it's not the terrorists who are celebrating, it's ordinary subjects. The popular mood is shifting rapidly as the war, this calamitous war effort, is winding down. It will reach a crescendo in January of 1905, following the massacre on so-called Bloody Sunday of a group of peaceful protesters who had gathered in St. Petersburg to petition Tsar Nicholas II. There's this old tradition in Russian history of the peasants, the ordinary people, being allowed at certain times of the year to bring petitions to the Tsar to appeal for redress of whatever grievances. They're led by a priest, a fellow by the name of Father Gapon, G-A-P-O-N, and they've put together a petition about living conditions and working conditions. Turns out Gapon is also a double agent. He's working for the state as well. He's going to lead the protest toward the Tsar's palace, and as they're making their way toward the Tsar's palace, police forces are going to be called out, Cossacks and other armed soldiers. Nicholas II isn't even in St. Petersburg. He's out at his summer estate, even though it's winter. And as the protesters begin marching towards the Winter Palace, the local commander orders that they disperse the crowd. And they first pull out their whips. The Cossacks would carry whips with them, and you just beat the ordinary people into submission. Use the pommel of your sword to hit them upside the head. And when that fails, because the crowd has grown to somewhere between 50 and 60,000 people, this is a really big protest. What are you going to do to bring it under control? Members of the elite Preobrazhensky regiment take up firing positions, and they are given orders to fire into the crowd to disperse it. It's estimated that 200 people are killed, another 800 or so are wounded in the ensuing volleys. Among the casualties are women and children. What the autocracy has done is has transformed these protesters into martyrs. And the event comes to be known as Bloody Sunday. I mean, there are a couple of other Bloody Sundays in history, but this is the one that's known in Russia. These events are going to shake Russian society to its core. And this event is going to help rupture the final bonds between state and society. In the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, massive strikes break out in protest of the killing. More than 400,000 workers will put down their tools in January alone. University students are going to hold rallies. They burn portraits of the Tsar. They burn him in effigy. They call for his overthrow. The disruptions grow so wide on university campuses that the Ministry of Education cancels the remainder of the academic year. Nicholas II doesn't want to give ground. He doesn't want to surrender any of his autocratic authority. He reluctantly agrees to allow the creation of a popularly elected National Assembly known as the State Duma. So he's under pressure now from his advisors. And what he agrees to allow is the formation of an elective representative body known as the State Duma, a National Assembly. When he announces this officially, it has the initial effect of sort of calming the revolutionary storm. But once people begin to read the fine print, when they come to realize late in the summer of 1905 that elected representatives are going to be chosen on the basis of a severely restricted franchise. You really only want the conservative upper classes to vote. Public anger surges once again. In the late summer of 1905, factory workers in St. Petersburg and Moscow again take to the streets. They're going to be joined by students. They're going to be joined by professionals. By mid-October of 1905, the first general strike in Russian history is well underway. It's estimated that 2 million people would take part. Businesses closed, newspapers suspended publication, telegraph and telephone exchanges curtailed operation, traffic on the empire's rail network ground to a halt. That would prove threatening to the cities, because if rail transport's not underway, food's not reaching Moscow and St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg, of course, is a really important one. You know where it's located. It's located at the mouth of the Neva River in the midst of a frickin' swamp. You've got to have food reach the capital, because if food doesn't reach the capital by rail, people starve. Right-wing groups are going to take advantage of the mounting chaos to begin launching violent attacks on Jews. Thousands of Jewish residents of the Russian Empire will be killed in the months that follow, in a wave of anti-Semitic pogroms that sweep across the empire's southern city. Pogroms are it's a name given to spontaneous, and in some cases, planned attacks targeting Jewish domiciles, businesses, synagogues, and residences. The group that is primarily responsible for this is an arch-conservative, arch-reactionary group known as the Black Hundreds. The Black Hundreds operate under a very simple slogan: save Russia, beat the Jews. They're the ones who are going to be leading most of this anti-Semitic violence, and it is very widespread. Revolutionary sentiment begins roiling the countryside. Further aggrieved because it looks like the harvest is going to be bad in 1905, peasant mobs set upon the homes and property of the provincial gentry. Remember Pugachevshchina? the Pugachev uprising under Catherine II, rural Russia is going to experience the worst wave of violence on the part of the peasantry since that period. It's estimated that as many as 3,000 gentry estates are destroyed in the summer and fall of 1905. That's roughly 15% of the country's entire total. So the cities are out of control, the countryside is out of control. Nicholas faces the prospect of the imminent collapse of law and order. He has two options: impose a military dictatorship and crack down, or give in to the public's demand for political reform. He is implored by senior military and political advisors to choose the latter, to give in, to provide concessions. But he vacillates. He can't decide. What seems to have turned the tide for him is that in an emergency meeting of state, called by Nicholas for his highest and his closest advisors, his uncle, the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, in the middle of this meeting, pulls out a revolver and sticks it to his head and tells the Tsar, "Give in or I'll blow my brains out." And it's only then that Nicholas II, clearly rattled, concedes. On the 17th of October, he issues a manifesto granting basic civil liberties, legalizing political parties, and broadening the franchise. It's known as the October Manifesto. You have to know that. The October Manifesto. The October Manifesto also establishes the State Duma's right to confirm future laws emanating from the state and, quote, to participate in the supervision of the legality of the actions of the Tsar's appointed officials. Exactly does that mean? Well, not quite sure. The government is going to respond to the uprisings in the countryside by dispatching troops. They first terminate the leftover reparations. Remember the 1861 emancipation and the reparations payments the serfs had to pay for 49 years? Those are hated. Finally, the government just says to hell with it, and they terminate them altogether. No more reparations payments. But that doesn't quell the peasants' anger. That's how ticked off they are. When the unrest continues, the autocracy simply sends out punitive military expeditions. They're dispatched into the countryside, and the peasant unrest will be put down by state violence. Before the rural uprising is quelled, it is estimated that 15,000 peasants have been summarily executed. 20,000 additional are going to be shot or wounded. 45,000 are deported or sent into exile. So it's going to be the violence of the state that is going to quash the unrest in the countryside. It is a combination of grudging concessions and brutal repression that saved the autocracy in 1905. No sooner does the revolutionary tide begin to abate, begin to die down, than Tsar Nicholas II, he begins walking back those political promises. On the 23rd of April, 1906, just days before the new State Duma is set to meet, the Tsar announces something known as the Fundamental Laws. The Fundamental Laws. These affirm his position as the nation's supreme autocrat, and they grant him new sweeping powers over the new elected assembly, the State Duma. The Tsar reserves the right to determine the length of Duma sessions. You can vote, you can have your elected representative, but the Tsar will determine how long they last. Once a Duma has been convened, the Tsar can dissolve the Duma before its members serve their full terms. The Tsar can also legislate via emergency decree when the Duma doesn't meet. The Tsar retains exclusive prerogative to appoint government members, to direct foreign policy and military affairs. The Tsar alone has the right to determine when and if Russia will go to war. Legislation passed by the Duma cannot become law unless it's approved both by the Tsar and something known as the State Council, this older consultative body dominated by reactionary nobles that now becomes sort of effectively the upper chamber. Okay, it'd be like the equivalent, sort of kind of like the equivalent of the Senate to the House of Representatives. What the fundamental laws do is they underscore the fact that the Tsar is not going to subordinate his will to rule of law. Understand the way the Duma works. You guys can hold your election. The Duma members convene, and you're cantankerous, you disagree, you use this as a platform for talking smack about the autocracy. The Tsar just steps in and dissolves the Duma. The Duma is now dissolved. The Tsar is going to rule by emergency decree. We're going to have new elections for the Duma, before which we're going to change the electoral law. So we're going to alter who can vote and how they're going to be represented. So that what the autocracy ends up doing is it undermines any legitimacy this institution might have before it can even develop it. The first Duma is dissolved by Nicholas only 10 weeks after it meets for the first time. The second Duma meets from the 20th of February to the 3rd of June before it's dissolved. And each time the government manipulates the election laws to ensure that the last two assemblies are going to be dominated by people with ideas more along the lines of maintaining the autocracy. The third Duma comes to be known as the Master's Duma, because it's the Duma whose composition is most closely in line with what the Tsar wants. There's going to be a fourth Duma. It's going to end up being dissolved after the outbreak of the First World War. This amounts then to Imperial Russia's abortive experiment with some kind of quasi-representative institution. And herein lies Russia's ultimate problem, especially Imperial Russia's ultimate problem. Absent fully independent civic institutions, absent a tradition of initiative, absent the experience of self-governance, Russia's middling stratum, its educated elite, comprised of professionals, businessmen, and small merchants, that group is far too small and far too weak. It has too little influence over the government to temper the reactionary bureaucracy. They can't move the government to change in a timely fashion. That middling class is also too small, it's too weak, it's too dispersed to moderate the growing anger and passions of the increasingly impatient lower classes and those revolutionary elements below. Nicholas's unwillingness to accommodate any kind of reform only served to alienate the state from educated society. So the state and its educated elite are being torn asunder, but the educated elite is increasingly drifting away from the demands of the masses. Radical forces on the left, especially elements of the Socialist Revolutionary Party and the Bolsheviks, are only redoubling now their efforts to instigate revolutionary violence. They're going to begin intensifying the terror campaigns, intensifying the attacks on banks, and in doing so, they're helping to destabilize, and eventually they're helping to break down the Russian social order. Having said that, this is 1905, and the imperial regime will last for almost another decade, during which time Russia is going to achieve a number of major milestones. Social and cultural milestones, also milestones in the development of technology and science. But the years that Russia has left from 1905 until the onset of World War I and the dissolution of the autocracy in 1917, those years amounted to little more than a death rattle for the autocracy. It was a dawning reality that society was being pulled apart. This was even beginning to affect contemporary artistic elites. This was not lost on members of the educated Russian classes. As early as December of 1908, in a public talk called The Elemental and Culture, a symbolist poet by the name of Alexander Blok described the foreboding felt by many members of the nation's educated elite. He would deliver his talk only a few days after a catastrophic earthquake had destroyed the Italian city of Messina, claiming 100,000 lives. Bloch, in making his comments, also had in mind the terrible violence of 1905-1906 that had roiled Russia's urban and rural regions. Terrible violence of the peasant unrest was still very fresh in the minds of Bloch. In his speech, Bloch would liken Russia's situation to impending cataclysm. He would say, "One way or another, we are living through a terrible crisis. We still do not know exactly what awaits us, but in our hearts we are aware the seismograph's needle is vibrating. Already we see ourselves as if against a background glow in a light, rickety airplane flying high above the earth, while beneath us, hidden behind clouds of ash, a rumbling, fire-breathing mountain releases streams of red-hot lava down its sides." What did Bloch mean? The technological heights to which Russians had recently ascended, the 1896 Nizhny Novgorod exhibition, offered scant hope in saving the country from the seething elemental rage percolating below amidst the urban working classes and the impoverished peasantry. Russia was set to erupt into revolutionary violence and rage. That eruption would be triggered by the pressures of war, a war that would come in the summer of 1914.